Um, First of all, Maxwell, long time no see.
It's
How are
been a
you
while.
doing, Max?
I'm doing well. How have things been with you?
Doing good, doing good. Yeah. And so, all right. So, Max, I think that what I want first of all is to ask you to maybe briefly introduce, your background to the audience, to the students here, and do that first before we ask you about your current role. Yeah.
Sure. So my name's Maxwell Koobatian. I'll take everyone through just a little bit of my background, starting with school. I did my undergraduate in chemistry at UC Merced, and then I did my PhD in biophysics and tissue engineering at the University of Buffalo, and I was there for about 5.5 years or so. And then I had graduated and went to KGI for a year in the PPM program. And that was a 1-year master's program, very similar to the MBS program. And from KGI, I had then placed with a few other classmates to work at Regeneron for a year or so in their research and operations arm of the company, and R&D operations. And then I went to Medtronic for about 2.5 years or so in diabetes in Northridge, California. And I was a product manager for their CGM arm of the company. And then I did some consulting for a little bit, and now I'm at Crinetics Pharmaceuticals. And I've been here for coming up, I would say, 2 years or so. It should be next month, 2 years. And I'm the associate director for new product planning.
So, what are what are the favorite aspects of the job? And if you will, maybe briefly summarize your current role. We know that you're associate director, you're doing product planning, but a little bit about what is that, and how did your Medtronic background sort of help with that?
Sure. So the role I'm in is a little bit of a jack of all trades in many cases. It's kind of a newer role. And I don't recall seeing this title, for example, maybe 5 years ago when I first started working. So I think it's kind of newer. And I report into business development, actually. Other parts of other people like me with the same title might report into different parts of the company. So they might report into chief operations officer. They might report into the commercial officer. Uh, I don't think I've seen marketing, have it report into marketing, but the the role that I'm in is really, the way I think of it, is internal strategy. So our scientists develop drugs or ideas for drugs, and I do my best to evaluate whether or not there's an unmet need for those drugs to benefit patients. And if it's a good idea and there's promise there, then I help make the case to move it forward. If there isn't promise, maybe there's a lot of good drugs on the market, it doesn't really have a home, it's too difficult to develop, or the business says, it's just too much trouble, or we're just not cut out for it, then I help make that call as well. So the way I think of it is really pre-commercial. So up to phase 1, give or take, and then after phase 1, I kind of step aside from it, and I let commercial then run with it from that point on.
So, what are the favorite aspect of the job?
So in my position, again, it's a little unique, because if you look at a big company like Pfizer or Sanofi or Amgen, you might have a new product planning person. And because the company's so big, everyone's jobs can be, not all the time, but it can be a little bit more pointed. That's not the way it is at Crinetics, at least where I'm at right now, there's only 140 people in the company, 150 people in the company, but we have 3 or 4 drugs, 4 or 5 different indications we're pursuing. So we're very heavy on discovery. And as a result, I own in many ways competitive intelligence, so that reports into me. I do the market research for all the assets, that also reports into me. In other companies, these actually would be entirely different departments with a lot of people working in them. So I have my hands on a lot of things that it's, in many cases, a lot of other folks they don't have that freedom or they don't have that responsibility. That being said, as we grow, those will get peeled away from me, I'm sure, one by one. As we build out commercial, they'll take a little bit of what I'm doing. As we build out pricing and reimbursement, they'll take a little bit of what I'm doing because I do a lot of pricing research. And then my job will become more pointed, if you will.
So it sounds to me like the favorite aspects of our jobs are also some of the most challenging aspects. You seems to enjoy the pressure and the growth.
Yes, it's the first day is not for everybody. You really do have to kind of learn on the job. I didn't know a lot about pricing even when I was doing consulting work. So I certainly enjoy the learning element to it because it never stops. The only way to get that kind of exposure in a larger company is if you actually start reaching out and talking to people that do pricing, that do reimbursement. You can understand what reimbursement strategy is, what contracting is, what price, how do you price a drug, and so on. It's not trivial. So those things typically are support functions for what I would do if I was in a bigger company. In my case, I'm actually doing them. So it's fun in that regard, but it's also just a lot of work. So you have to be careful on what you bite off.
Yeah. So does your role work hand in hand with intellectual property and regulatory affairs? These are two different functions, but it just sounds like what you're doing is connected to them.
So short answer, yes. I've made my function in the competitive intelligence tie into intellectual property, and they're very closely tied together. And I'm not a lawyer, but I would say 20% of my time is working with our head of IP because there are patent concerns, not just of ourselves, but of competitors. So I think there's one thing that's commonly overlooked is a lot of companies think, well, when our drug goes off patent, then we face a patent cliff. It's actually worse than that in many cases. If a competitor that's on the market faces a patent cliff, you also face a patent cliff in many cases, because if you're treating the same disease and the efficacy is similar and they're the ones that are going to be facing generics, payers are not going to be paying you a premium if they can turn around and prescribe something different. So there's this tie-in with intellectual property that we have to take into account when we think about our competitive landscape, because that directly ties into the business arm, which is what are your revenues going to be? If your patent cliff is going to be a few years earlier than what you have forecast for peak sales, then that's going to hurt your stock price. That's going to hurt your ability to grow. That's going to hurt your ability to raise money. So there is this strategy arm to intellectual property that you have to always keep in mind. With regulatory, it's the exact same thing. There are instances where you would get better pricing by actually limiting your indication and having it be tailored towards a very specific population. Just as an example, similar to what I shared, if your drug has 2 or 3 indications and one of them is going generic from a competitor, it's actually good for you to not include that on purpose in some cases, and really narrow the scope of your drug to go after a very specific patient population, because you're on label for that, and it's not legal to market off label. So these are strategies that commercial thinks about and you have to communicate to regulatory to then understand, well, how do you actually get this approved? Are you going to have any pushback? And if you do get pushback from the regulators, and if you get pushback from your payers, how do you deal with that? There's a lot of more the pieces that have to fall in place in order for a drug to be successful.
Reminds me of the bioscience strategy costs a lot.
True.
Yeah, the is the more indication, sometimes is a double-edged sword that way. There's the issue of pricing versus volume, right? And
Right.
the inelasticity, demand inelasticity of the drug, is going to affect a lot of whether you could maximize your value revenue one way or another. Now, so pivoting from that, your current company, tell us a little bit about the work culture, any thing that you like working at this company, and whether some of those features that you enjoy are unique to your company.
It's I'll say this with a tiny asterisk, which is that I haven't worked in that many companies to know how it compares to other companies. I was at Regeneron for a year, and I had done 2.5 at Medtronic. I would say the culture in a startup that is growing is a lot more fun, supportive, kind of outgoing than a blue chip company, if you will, with very, very predictable, or in some cases even constriction. So I wouldn't have it any other way now. I do, however, think everyone should put in some time at a large company, though. They're successful and big for a reason, is because they do know what it is they're doing. So it is important to learn how a big company operates, how they prioritize things, how they approach things. But taking those lessons, tying it into something that is promising, a little bit more high risk if you're earlier in your career, I think they're very valuable lessons. And you can kind of wear both hats and think from, okay, if we were a big company, we would be approaching it this way. If we were a smaller company, we would be approaching it this way. I do think the only way, especially for when you think commercial, to be successful is to put time in at an Amgen, at a Pfizer, at a Sanofi, because there is this machine in many cases. There are arms of the company, everything from operations to manufacturing to quality, that you do have to kind of understand how they work, and you don't want to build that kind of thing on the fly. So, and there's really no class to teach you these kinds of things, because they're different from one company to another, to another, to another. Pfizer is going to be very different from Amgen. It's going to be very different from Regeneron. So it's very much on the job, talking to people, learning from them, taking those lessons, and then putting into a smaller company. I think that's just very fun and very rewarding, and it certainly is. At least for me, it keeps me going a lot more easily.
Awesome. So, sort of pivoting again. So, we now know about the current role that you have, your company, and then your career path since KGI, as well as your academic career. So one thing that I'm curious about is that finishing off your PhD at the time, why did you come to KGI? I mean, like there might be other business schools, or there might be opportunities where you could go straight into industry. I don't know your situation on that. Why did you come to KGI?
At the time, the PPM program, I think, was a pretty good fit for what I was looking at the time. It is enough of a business curriculum to be able to switch roles, move kind of from more of an R&D world into something a little bit more with a business focus. And I probably would do it all over again. The only thing that I would, if I had a plan B, and I do go back and forth at times and think about maybe I should have done things differently, maybe it would have been actually more of a law cut, and not so much of a business cut. There are folks within the business arm that have PhDs. They're not necessarily in intellectual property, but they're a lot more on the transactional side of things, deals, mergers, acquisitions, and to put some time into a law firm and understand how these deals are structured, why they're structured the way they are, how do you break royalties up the way you do. It is very good to have kind of that law hat on. It's not, it's certainly not necessary, that's for sure. But it's I would say it's something that I probably could have and should have maybe seriously considered more if I look back on things. But the KGI program at the time was what I needed. I didn't want to put in another 2-3 years within the MBA after 6 years of a PhD. So, and the relationship with Regeneron at the time was, and I don't know if it's still, if you guys still have it, but it was at least a fantastic partnership.
We still have the relationship with Regeneron. Ross, I think, is still on the should still be on the trustees. And yeah, and then beside you, there are so many of the students in PPM graduates that we place with Regeneron.
Yeah.
And so yeah, but and coming to DEC, what you described, is something that I think that in KGI that we hype a lot on, and that's the networking. And so give us the secret sauce. How good were you at networking when you first came to KGI? Did we like make you better at networking, or yeah?
Excuse me. I think I mean, it certainly makes you better, that's for sure. But I am going to say it's not easy. It's just the way it is. And within life science and medical devices specifically, I think it is even a little bit more challenging than other industries. So, and there's also a little bit of an element of, well, you can network amongst your class, and that's very important. But if you're trying to get that first job, there's only so much benefit that has, because no one else has jobs at the time. You're all looking for jobs. So there is that barrier there, and I don't have an answer for that, other than looking at other folks that have graduated from KGI, and maybe not even necessarily KGI. I had spoken to a few folks that had graduated from Drucker just across the way, other members within the Claremont Consortium. A few folks that only did summer programs. You can search them on LinkedIn and so on. For the most part, people are very responsive, even if you're not asking for a referral for a position. You simply want to learn more about what it is they do. And just simply maintaining those kinds of connections through the years, it takes some work, but it's well worth the effort. And then when you do get into your first job, it's always the most difficult job. It's just getting your first job. It's just constantly speaking to everybody. And so that networking does kind of continue, and it gets a lot easier at that point. And people get promoted, they leave. Companies might shrink in size or they grow in size. So you're always going to have this movement of people. And the best advice I ever had when I had gone to Medtronic was you have to make friends with every single person on this floor. And it wasn't just for networking; it was also just to move projects along. That's networking. And there will be a day where you'll say, okay, I noticed so and so is at a different company, and there's a role there that I quite like, and we work very well together on a team. They're more than happy to provide a referral to you. There are incentives, in fact, for these referrals. If you refer someone to a big company, I've seen bonuses go $5,000, $10,000. So it's in both parties' interest to maintain these connections, network, and ultimately refer each other for positions.
We have a term for that in economics called matching markets or market design. It's a very hot area where people are looking at markets where it's not just commodities, right? Where there's a price taker, but more how are you able to use non-price, where price is not the main thing, and how you're trying to match the different people, labor markets, for example, is one of those matching markets, kind of market design thing. And with that, it really feels like, it's not definitely not easy, but Max, you're very entrepreneurial, very unique, outgoing kind of student that we had at KGI. And one of the things that I noticed about you is that this willingness to be open-minded to is essentially take risks. And so, like you talk about higher risk at startups. And so how do you gauge your, as one of our student audience here mentioned, how do you gauge your personal risk tolerance? And how does that translate to your professional
Well,
risk tolerance? Because you think about it, right? You have your personal risk, and then you are shaping the different products, go, no go. That's your professional risk tolerance. And how do you do that?
well, first of all, risk, I think is the appropriate word. I would say calculated risk. It isn't as if you're coming in with error bars that are all over the place. There's always a risk. Drugs get rejected that you think get approved all the time. I would say that for me, going into a smaller company as opposed to a bigger company, I think it was put quite well by someone that I had met. I forgot his name. It was some kind of a gathering, I think, at our company, and he had said that the risk of you keep having your job is the same at both a small company and a large company. At the end of the day, the only difference is the risk of the small company existing is at the end of the day is lower. And I think that was quite profound. So if you're in a bigger company, there's always going to be this element of reorganization, shuffling of responsibilities, layoffs, hiring. And if you compare the turnover in that environment to, say, the turnover in a startup, they're actually a lot closer than you would think. But the big company will probably still be there. The smaller company, on the other hand, might get bought or moved or changed. But at the end of the day, where you are and within these two universes actually is not too different. The risk reward, however, can have significant upside if you're in the right place and you're in at the right time in a smaller company. It is not unheard of for a company to get bought out, have everyone's stock options vest immediately at a 200% premium. That happens. And there was a company, two of them, as a matter of fact, Turning Point, that was just acquired here in San Diego last week. And not too much, maybe 2 or 3 months earlier, Arena was also bought by Pfizer for, I think, a 200% premium. So you wake up in the morning, you find out that your bank account is double of what you were expecting, and that's not unheard of. Now, it also goes the other way. You find out that something fails and you lose 80% of your holdings. That also happens. So the whole element of options, for example, and your incentives is the upside is higher than your downside as long as you're actually pulling in a salary that is respectable. And I do think they are in my world. If I take my salary and I compare it to your Amgens, your Zanofis, and Pfizer's, they're the same. We get paid just as much as anybody else does. But I would say that if I had to put my bets on a swing in your favor, it would probably be a little bit more in the startup world. Now, at the current moment, the stock market is destroying the entire biotech startup universe. I mean, there are valuations that are down 50, 60, 70% or so. So it's a really tough time at this moment for startup biotech, but it's like anything with markets, these times will go away and then there'll be this shift back into risk assets. And if your timing is good, there is upside for you. So it's all about calculated risk. I don't lose any sleep over it simply because, again, my salary is the same as anybody else's. And that's good enough for me, and people move around into different companies all the time. So it doesn't, I don't lose any sleep over it.
So Max, I feel like you have taken a very, entrepreneurial, career pathway, to where you are now. Um, did you envision that, you will, take this path, back in your undergrad days?
I'll just, so the word entrepreneurial, I always have, I don't want to say an issue with, but um, I think it's fair to say the founders of the company are entrepreneurial. They were the ones that did the initial fundraising. They were the ones that got the SBIR grants even before the fundraising. They were the ones with the idea. I'm helping move the company, but I would be doing that in both a Pfizer setting as well as my setting or an Amgen setting. But I have a lot more responsibility, and I do have a little bit more sway with things. So I'm not a full-blown entrepreneur in that sense. I have a job that allows me to have movement. I'm not as risky in that case. My risk profile is not as high as our founders. I'm not going to say, oh, I have this drug and I want to make it a marketed treatment. That is not me by
But you
any
have
means.
chosen to throw in your lot with an entrepreneur organization, and as you said
That
that
is correct.
you
Yes.
feel that the difference is not that big, but still, for many people, entrepreneur organizations are, a lot more turbulent, and so it
Yeah,
is a different career pathway.
it is. I mean, I joined when there were 70 people in the company. We're now at 140, 150. Amgen doesn't double in size in a year. And then I think that's why you have this difference mindsets. So it is more entrepreneurial to say, okay, I know that things are going to be very different in 6 months, and you can kind of mentally even think about what it's going to look like. Uh, so I didn't think that I would be in a position like this, in undergrad, even grad school, even KGI, uh, because I was thinking of it from, I think, a lens that wasn't appropriate. I was thinking of it more of a, well, startups aren't going to pay what you get paid at a larger company. You're not going to get the same benefits, health insurance, 401k, that kind of a thing. That's not true. And I think once you know that, then your appetite for risk, or your appetite to be a little bit more entrepreneurial, as you put it, it's a lot more manageable, and that's okay. And again, you sleep a lot better at night. It takes some adjusting, but when you also see the pains and gains of a larger company, I don't see a difference actually. I've been in companies, Medtronic was actually shrinking when I was there. So you do go in and you see a marketing team that gets laid off and they get their severance packages or they get placed somewhere else in the company. Uh, the stress profile is, at the end of the day, very similar, I would say. I don't personally see any difference.
Good. Now, back in the days, I still remember when you were, in KGI and looking for jobs, and the situation at that time is somewhat different from the labor markets nowadays. Very different. And I mean, I would have never imagined labor markets now like what we have now. Um, so, and of course, economists have found that people who graduate into recessions and people who graduate into very hot labor markets have very different career paths. And given that now you're on the other side of the aisle, right? as an associate director, as your company also grow, and you probably have seen a lot of resumes and have seen people come and go, turnover in your company, and not only here but elsewhere as well. And you have went through a couple of cycles in the
Mhm.
industry. What advice would you give to a new student or potential applicant at KGI?
Yeah, there's nothing you can do about markets. So I have no advice there. And anyone who claims to have advice on it, I would take it with a huge side of salt. You just have to deal with the markets. And yeah, you have a good memory. It wasn't very good when I had first was looking for positions. So you do get a situation where your application number 35 and application, of 150. And there's nothing you can do about that. The only advice I have is, let's say you want to do marketing, just as an example, and it's a tough market. That does not mean you have to do marketing. You can still do marketing. It's just not the time to do marketing. So if you do operations, if you do regulatory, if you do something else, that's fine. In fact, it's good because when you do start, when the markets get better and things start opening up a bit, those are going to be spots that need to be filled, and they're going to want people that have a little bit more of a holistic approach to things, and they'll be looking for folks that are well-rounded and that actually have an appetite for change. You can always do things along the side that prepare you for that. So even though I'm in new product planning, I don't want to do regulatory necessarily, but I still did a regulatory certificate, for RAPs. I did the strategic alliance certificate. I'm not in strategic alliances, but it is still proof that if you want to make that switch, you've done your homework, and they will open you with open arms, especially if you start networking within these departments. So if I have any advice, it's don't let don't let the good be the enemy here if you really want perfect. And there's always going to be a way to get to where you want.
All right. I want to, open up to the students for, for Q&A. But before I do that, Max, do you have any closing thoughts, before we do that?
No, I'd love to hear from everyone else. This is their time more than mine. So I'm sure if I didn't answer a question fully, it's because I don't want to just graze the surface with things. I'd rather be a little bit more thoughtful. So
Yeah.
fire away.
Yeah. So
We have a couple questions in the chat, but I thought if it's okay with you, we might let the folks ask on their own. So Beatrice Smith, if you'd like, I see you have a couple questions. If you'd like to unmute and ask, you're more than welcome to.
Hey, actually, some of my questions have already been asked by Professor Chalk, but I'm still very curious to know, you started out in product, or not started out, but you had a role in product management, and then you transitioned to like this new role. How do they differ? Like, I'm not terribly familiar with product management. It's something that I'm curious to learn more about as I embark on my journey at KGI. But what you do now, it sounds really fascinating too. So it sounds like it was a great stepping stone, to that.
Right. So good point. So this is the issue with titles, is that you can use the word product management. It can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people, and it changes from different industries. So there's product development, there's product management, there's project management, there's program management, there's portfolio management, and I could probably find 2 or 3 similarities across all of them that everyone does. I see myself a little bit more as corporate strategy. That being said, I do manage programs, so there is a product management aspect to it. I would say the thing that really makes product management kind of stand on its own is that it's really on you to ensure that what you're managing actually addresses an unmet need. That does not mean you have to do market research, but it does mean that you need to do your homework. And if you're managing something and it does not fit an unmet need, so do you change it? Do you pivot? Your relationship is going to be closer with research and development, with maybe the clinical team, with even manufacturing, than it is, say, with sales or marketing, because you're trying to get something in good enough shape to then hand off to commercial or hand off to sales to then run with. That's my take on product management. Project
Okay.
management is you're managing something, but you're not making a lot of those insights or decisions on what goes into the final product. However, those folks have typically a long list of things they're managing. So it's a
More of
little
the
bit,
ombudsman.
yeah.
Okay. Thank you. I
Um,
appreciate that.
and then portfolio management is even a little bit more different, because you're thinking revenues and you're thinking employees and you're thinking growth and you're thinking how much money is this going to create and where does that money go, and life cycle management, and that's a little bit different too. So there's a lot of different managements, and it takes a long time to really figure out what, it's not easy. It takes a long time to figure out the nuances between them.
Okay, great. I appreciate you clarifying that.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.
And Kusha, you want to ask the question yourself?
They were okay with reading it, so I can read that one. It was a follow-up on the last question you asked, Dr. Chalk, about hiring. So the question is, what impresses you most when you're considering hiring someone?
I'd say and it's not just me, I would say, in fact, I think it was Peter Drucker that had said that culture eats strategy for business, or breakfast rather. And there's a lot of truth to that. I mean, I would much rather have someone who is able to build a healthy culture within the company that is supportive, that is a team player, that is not a cowboy and goes off and just does things on their own. That's actually very hard to find. Soft skills become a lot more difficult to find than hard skills. And it's kind of like this upside down pyramid in many ways. So as you progress, you would think that the hard skills matter more and more. It actually is not the case. It's the fact that your soft skills outweigh your hard skills, because it's up to you to start managing teams. You don't have the time to start running simulations or doing the modeling yourself, or you have to trust people that have those hard skills. And when you're in a growing company, you need to be able to find those people that can take on those leadership roles. And you can't send someone to an Excel boot camp to start learning these kinds of things. So I would much rather take someone with an appetite to learn, that is that certainly comes across a lot more as a team player, than someone who says, I can just model everything and you don't have to worry about it. Well, that's not really a team player. So, and I can pick that out relatively easily. Our interview process is not trivial as well. I mean, I remember when I was interviewed for my position, it was basically 2 or 3 days, and I spoke to maybe 10 or 15 people. And then they all score you individually. And at the end of the day, there's a score that goes into that. And they look for more reasons to not hire you in many cases than to hire you, because they know that you're going to be working, in my case, with, say, regulatory, with clinical, with sales, with commercial, with business, with, and my manager doesn't want to know, or rather, my manager doesn't want to think, is he going to be okay getting along with people in this group? We'll deal with the hard stuff later, but that's probably, in my opinion, the number one thing. That being said, you still need to demonstrate you can do the things that you need to do. But it just gets harder the higher the titles become, not because of the hard skills, but it's actually the soft skills.
The next question was, what year did you graduate? I'm not sure if you've mentioned that since Robert asked.
What year was it? I think it was 2015. I'm pretty sure it was 2015 or 16. I think I graduated my PhD in 15 and I graduated KGI in 16. I'll actually have to check.
I just posted your LinkedIn on chat, and so students can look at it.
You know, someone might have to tell me.
But you're correct.
It all gets blurred together.
So Lily has a question on what ethical considerations do you have to consider in your work?
The life sciences are just filled with ethical concerns and issues, and they change daily. It can be anything from patient privacy to how you design your clinical trials to the dosing of the drugs you use for your first in human trial. It's across the board, and it's extremely important to have firm and confident guidance from your legal teams and your regulatory teams, because the FDA will know where those lines are, but you're not going to, in many cases, you may not know until it's too late. And then you have to then restructure a clinical trial design or restructure how you're approaching the disease state in general. It happens even with our drugs. You know, we have a drug that treats a very, very rare condition for pediatric patients. You know, so it's diagnosed at birth, and you have these extremely high levels of insulin. So how do you treat that? Well, we think we have a great treatment for that, but there are ethical concerns now on how do we start dosing infants with a drug in a safe way, while possibly removing the one standard of care that's been proven to work, even though we believe our treatment is better than what it is they're getting. You can't just put this in the patients that are diagnosed with it at birth. And then if you swing to the other way, there's this whole issue with regards to, well, what are the ethical concerns when it comes to paying investigators or clinical trial sites? And how do you pay, participants? And there's Sunshine Act, so everything is now open for the most part, and you'll be in many cases, surprised on just how much money pharmaceutical companies do spend on specific investigators to investigate a specific disease. So there's a whole debate now in compliance, and there's a whole debate on where those lines are drawn. And then there's ethical concerns on the pricing for the pharmaceuticals in the first place. So are you going to price something so high that it's out of reach? Well, in many cases, years ago, that would occur. Now we have copay programs, and insurance companies are more apt to cover the price for drugs and out-of-pocket expenses. So you have these debates that just go on, and they change all the time. So I don't have a straight answer other than it's very case by case. And if you want to have case studies where things go very badly, you can always look up the opioid epidemic and the Sackler family in Purdue and draw your own conclusions from that. But at the same time, you also have a lot of cases where, say Regeneron, where they'll pursue, and they've said this, when I was there at least, that they'll pursue a drug even if is a very small patient population that has an unmet need that they're actually able to address, and that's enough for them. So you're going to get a spectrum of how companies manage these kinds of issues, and it's very important to keep a mental checklist of it.
So speaking of that spectrum, just zeroing on one company characteristic, which is size, large company versus small companies. Are there like in your view, are there like difference between small and big companies, and some of the things that Emmanuel was one of the students here is thinking about is that is like small companies more dynamic, scrappy, experimental compared to big companies, or whether industry regulations just like FDA just basically force small companies to have very little room for maneuvering.
Well, the FDA is going to be just as firm across the board, big or small. So the size of the company doesn't, I've never seen play any role. And they're going to be hard on you no matter what. I do think there's some truth to small companies being able to pivot or be a little bit more scrappy. I think there is some truth to that. That being said, I would never underestimate how fast a company, say like Pfizer, can move. I mean, you can just look at the COVID vaccine as evidence of that. You have this massive this massive pharmaceutical company, and they're also marketing geniuses in many ways, and they're able to go, to the mat and compete right on par with Moderna, which is a very small, scrappy company in Boston, and in many cases actually surpass them on a lot of metrics. So I think there is some truth to the smaller company in the sense that there is less bureaucracy that you have to deal with in many cases. There is a little bit easier to get some things done. That being said, I have a lot of headaches because there's a lack of processes. So I spend a lot more time on things that would be point, click, drag, drop in a larger company. I can walk away and because they have an infrastructure and they have the money to support that kind of an infrastructure. So I think it's personally a little bit more of preference. I hesitate to kind of paint that brush completely. I think there's some truth to it, but I'm a little hesitant to go as far as a lot of people when they describe small companies versus large.
So yeah, so that early on we sort of asked you questions about career paths, and you share your experience on what you have done back in those days, but the labor markets have changed significantly now. So nowadays, for young people, for prospective students, or current KGI students, what are the pathway or options that you would think would be like currently the best way to start their preparation to work? What kind of positions?
So it kind of ties into what we've spoken about earlier, which is I do believe, and I'm the first to say I didn't like it, but it's worth doing, is work for a bigger company. And again, learn why they are successful and spend some time there. I'm the first to say sometimes it's not fun, at least for me. Other people's love it. It's a little bit more predictable in some ways. There is a little bit more structure and so forth, but there's so many lessons to learn when it comes to a very successful company that is able to drive revenue over and over and over again. They know how to think about patent expirations. They know how to think about life cycle management. They know how to prioritize their programs. They know how to make sure that the shareholders stay happy. There's a lot to learn there. And when you learn that, it becomes very valuable for a promising startup. And when you make that move, you are able to then provide more value than if you only lived in a startup environment. It's harder to go the other way because you can't take a startup mentality, go into say Pfizer and say, I'm going to have a startup mentality in Pfizer. It's very hard to have a lot work that way. But there's a lot of very promising companies that need that insight. So that would probably be, my recommendation. If you're thinking about how to become successful, it's to just continuously learn, understand what works, and then find a place for your skill set.
It sounds like, the career advice that you have basically is time tested, because it feels like, it hasn't really changed. That there's this need for this sort of meandering. Um, a few years ago, when the stock market valuation was very high, some of the students were changing their focus from established companies to startups
Right.
because of their potential stock options there. But coming back to Earth now, thinking about it, right? Is that if you think that in terms of the career lifespan, those things are time tested. The principles you mentioned are time tested and haven't really changed.
It's I know this would be a whole other talk, but I think there's also this, when people think about, I have an idea for a very successful product and I'm going to go start a company off of it. That's not how you should go about doing this. You really have to do your homework and ask yourself, is there actually an unmet need here? And when the labor market favors risk, and I look at a lot of companies, I know which ones have done their homework and know, are they actually addressing an actual unmet need? Because if I see 4 or 5 companies going after a single target that is already well addressed by a totally different company, they haven't done their research. So they're going to get hammered when the market turns, because the investors are going to look at this and they go, it's just not worth the risk anymore, and they're going to pull they're going to pull off. They're going to pull their money out. So I think that's very important to keep in mind, which is, you can never fight the markets, but when you are looking for your first job, or you're looking at starting in your career, do your homework and make sure that the company has a good North Star and that they actually are building something that addresses unmet needs. When I was looking for jobs, that's exactly what I did. I looked at all their pipelines. I looked at all the competitors that were out there. How many were there? What makes them special and different? And you'd be surprised just how many are Me Too's in many cases, and they think they're special. It's not to say that there's no value there, but it is to say that you might be able to find more value somewhere else. And keeping that in mind will really pay off.
All right, one last question, and this relates to drug pricing.
Yes.
And what are the major factors that you consider when determining the price of drugs? And when thinking about that consideration, maybe tell us a little bit also about market channels, distribution. It could be also international distribution and market channels as well, or it could be true insurers, as you said about non-insurer routes and those things.
So I wish I could do a whole pricing class in 1 minute, but if you have a drug that is the greatest, it cures cancer, whatever it is, doesn't matter if the payers don't pay for it. You have to work with the payers to make sure that you come up with the price that pay for it. And you have to make sure that the rebating is appropriate so that you walk away with enough money to keep the lights on, but at the same time that you're able to get on what we call a formulary. So in other words, a doctor is able to put in a prescription and actually get it filled without needing to fill out prior authorizations, jump through a lot of hoops and so forth. And this is a very complicated world of market research and pricing research that has only become more complex as time goes on. So you actually can talk to payers. It's not like they're hiding and you're unable to speak with them. They will speak to you and they'll tell you what a fair price is. And they'll tell you, look, you've got these drugs with similar outcomes and they're priced here, and you're coming in and you have 30% improvement. So we would be okay with a price premium of 50%. That is completely available for someone in my position or in a reimbursement position to research. And if there's any advice to take away is, don't think you're the exception. It sucks when a payer says, we think you're only going to get $50,000 a year for this, and you were hoping for 300,000. I've seen it, but that does not mean you go to the market and price at 300,000. So there is this readjustment of expectations, and it's painful, but and it's not what a lot of people want to hear. But it's easy to get beaten up on pricing and have it come too late in drug development.
All right. Thank you so much, Max, for this talk. It has been a long time since we last saw each other, and you have career growth has like just been exponential. I'm really very grateful for you taking the time to talk to the students and the prospective applicants today. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Oh, well, it was great meeting with you again, Jay. And please reach out. I think someone put my link somewhere in the chat. So I hope to stay in touch and hopefully meet in person sometime.
I did put your LinkedIn on the chat, because just now the students were asking about when you graduate, and I have a phone number, and so definitely, yeah, we'll touch base.
Anytime, Jay. Take care. Thanks again. Cheers.
Take care.